I monitor alien activity for a living. What's coming next is terrifying. My hands were sweating. They had not done that in years of interviews, years of watching faces and instruments, and the thin numbers that usually told me everything I needed to know. This sweat came from somewhere other than nerves. It came from the room itself. The air felt thicker, as if sound had been slowed to let each syllable hang. Across from me, the observer tilted its head. I had met efficient silence before. Machines had quieted, witnesses had choked on words. But the observer's silence was deliberate, measured, like a pause made to let meaning gather size. It was not a being that needed language the way we do. It favored gestures, temperature shifts, the precise arrangement of pressure on the floorboards. When it finally gave me anything that resembled speech, the sensation arrived in my chest rather than my ears. A pressure, an image, a sentence folded into light. I asked a question I shouldn't have asked. Why are you watching us? It was a stupid, ordinary question, the kind an interviewer asks because it occupies the moment. But the room changed when the question left my mouth. The observer's head tilted further. I could feel something like a tension passing over me, cataloguing the weight of the syllables. Then, not words, not a list of motives, a single, cold fact pressed against my bones. Knowledge changes responsibility. It didn't explain. It didn't promise. It simply laid that down like a rule, as if I had stepped into a library and someone had set a book on the table. You have read this now. You cannot unread it. I left the interview with my recorder and my notebooks and the standard debriefing checklist. But something in me had altered in a way a checklist could not capture. I slept badly. I woke with imaginary conversations. My hands kept clenching, seeking the familiarity of pen and paper. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. That line, a small professional prompt, felt absurd against the weight in my chest. But the work requires an audience at times. Someone has to notice the pattern when the pattern is quiet. I told myself that aloud like a protocol. Then I began to collect. At first the signs were absurdly domestic. Friday, I noted in the margin, cinnamon. On Monday, a vending machine in the lobby of my building dispensed a packet of cinnamon in place of sugar. I laughed it off. I took the sugar and dumped it into my coffee anyway. Tuesday night, a lamp in my apartment flickered in 3 deliberate blinks when I passed beneath it. Another laugh, smaller, followed. I started to mark these things down because listing the small anomalies made them manageable on paper. Wednesday, I walked past the same street where I always saw a blue car parked under the sycamore. I thought of red cars, on impulse, a small experiment, childish. Imagine a red car, I told myself. In the next block, a red sedan hummed past. Coincidence, I wrote. But coincidences began to come in sequences. A broken cup in the office kitchen one morning, no one admitted spilling it. A call at 2:22 a.m. from a number that had no returned listing. A song that repeated in the market, the chorus snagging under my skin until it mapped onto the line the observer had given me. I started running tests the only way I knew how. Simple, repeatable, embarrassing experiments. They read like the notes of someone trying to become a scientist out of curiosity and fear. Notebook, red car test. Day 1. Imagine red car crossing the 3rd intersection from the station. Wait. Result. Red sedan passes within 5 minutes. Field note. Probability high for urban area, need control. Red car test. Day 2. Imagine red car at the corner of Elm and 6th. Wait. Result. Red delivery van color off. Field note. Fail. Red car test. Day 3. Imagine red car with sunroof. Wait. Result. Convertible red sports car stops at light 2 blocks away. Field note. Repeat with blind observer. I recruited a volunteer from a forum. Someone who liked the idea of being a data point. She sat across from me, eyes bright with the same mixture of skepticism and hunger I felt. I read her a script, asked her to picture a red car in precise terms, then left the room. She signaled when she had the image. We timed our wait. We recorded. When I came back, she had been sitting at the table, visibly shaken. "So?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. We checked the street camera footage. A red car did in fact pass within the window of our observation, turning at the exact second she had expected it to. There was no obvious cause. There was nothing in the traffic pattern that would have explained the timing. The cameras confirmed the movement, but not the mechanism. These were slender, tentative things, hints, nudges, but they had the shape of a pattern, sustained attention, accompanied by an outcome that conformed to the shape of that attention. Over the course of that week, the sequence played out enough times that I began to feel the weight of the observer's phrase. Knowledge changes responsibility. If the world bent in small ways, in response to attention, what did that mean when millions tuned to the same fear at once? I kept to the protocols I had trained in. I logged times. I set up blinds. I ran control tests. I recorded weather, TV schedules, delivery logs. I did not trust anecdote, and so I tried to strip the anecdote until only data remained. Data, at least, could be argued with. And yet the small experiments crept into the rest of my life. On a Wednesday in November, I placed a coin on the back stoop of the old neighborhood grocery. A trivial test, really. "Imagine finding this coin," I wrote in the margin, "and then secret it so you can discover it later." When I returned, the coin had moved, a thumbprint of mud on the railing I had scrapped in removing it. On the same afternoon, someone in the building across from mine started to clap in a rhythm that matched a melody stuck in my head since the observer's visit. I could feel the ridiculousness of my notes. I could also feel the tightening. People in my field have ways of containing wonder. We build layers of explanation, perceptual error, statistical noise, cultural resonance. We like to be the adults who point out the missing link. I was trying to be that adult. But after 3 weeks of experiments, I had to admit to myself, whatever was happening was not limited to me. There were echoes in places I did not touch. I began to leave marginal notes in the logs that were not for any committee. Impressions, feelings, apologies to the future reader who might think me a fool. One entry reads, "Apology for superstition, but I sensed directionality, not magic, not wholly random." Another, "It feels like a rule, not absolute, but a pressure." Then I found a message, not addressed, slipped under a door at 3 a.m. "Come map it." The handwriting was blocky, like someone who writes labels in a hurry. It is a strange thing to meet other people who have seen the same trembling at the edge of your life. You expect cultists or lunatics. What I found instead at the first meeting was a group that looked like misfits from the same missing manual. A retired geography teacher with crayon stains on her sleeves, a man who called himself a tester and who had the scar of a stubborn curiosity on his knuckles, an artist who carried a roll of canvas like a shield, an ex-soldier who wore his calm like body armor and kept his explanations clipped. There were others too. A woman who claimed to receive impressions and images. Receiver, she said. And a quiet person who called themselves a blocker, whose practice was to stand between the group and whatever pulled at them and breathe. They called themselves the 8 by joking necessity. The number changed with time and attrition, but the nickname stuck. We met in odd spaces, basements with low ceilings, abandoned storefronts, a room above a laundromat that smelled of detergent and old fabric. Our first meeting felt like the precise moment of conspiracy turned mundane. We traded notes, the cinnamon, the blinking lamp, the red car, the moved coin. We did not have a theory. We had patterns. "I map," the retired teacher said simply, unrolling a paper that had been fastened with tape and thumbtacks. It looked like a map of a city made by someone who drew emotion as if it were geography. Neighborhoods shaded in dense, pulsing red where fear had clustered. Pockets of green where people had reported quiet joy, thin blue veins connecting a hospital and a church where grief seemed to flow. She called the lines traces, and she assured us she had been mapping them for months, at first as curiosity and then as obsession. The tester, Miles, who liked to rub his thumb over the bitten edge of his lip, described the rain test. He would stand in a park with headphones and count, aloud, for the length of a particular storm. He would imagine a word, not a sentence, and every time the word repeated around the city he would mark it. "I don't know why the storms answer more than the quiet," he said. "But sometimes, when enough people keep feeling the same thing through a storm, the storm falls where they want it to." The receiver, named Annika, spoke of images that arrived not with voice, but as textures. "It's like wallpaper," she said, pressing her palms together as if to hold the pattern. "I'll see a street lit in amber and people walking with the same hesitation. It stays with me." She had begun to document these impressions in watercolors, smudged edges and blurred faces that nonetheless repeated across her pages. Our conversations were a mix of method and confession. We debated the ethics of any intervention. We argued about whether to publish. Harold, a name I do not use here because in my field you are expected to carry the burden without dramatic monikers, was not present. I was, in my notes, the narrator and the recorder. I kept the distance for a while, until I could not. Some of the group treated our phenomenon like a problem to be solved. Others treated it like a wound to be tended. The blocker, a woman named Ruth, practiced intentional silence. She would sit between people and a noise, and breathe sharply until the edge of the noise dulled. She claimed it reduced the intensity of an event in her immediate vicinity. It sounded like superstition. It also sounded like a practice grounded in attention. What surprised me was how quickly methodological disagreements became moral ones. If attention could bring things into being, and we used the phrase bring into being with caveats, with conditional language and hedges, then attention could also kill. A viral panic, multiplied across screens and tongues, could tighten and morph and manifest. Conversely, a slow, sustained gratitude, a deliberate and quiet joy held by millions, might ease or generate different outcomes. We tested in small ways at first. We tried to remove ourselves from the loop. Miles would imagine something banal while the rest of us looked away. We chose the most trivial targets we could. A blue napkin, a single pigeon on a ledge, a glass door left unlatched. We tried to control for ordinary causality. For every success we filed another page of failures. For every failure we filed another page of doubt. Journal Tuesday 19th, blink test. Lamp blinked 3 times when observer mentioned the word threshold. Field note, anecdote, look for pattern. Journal, Sunday 24th, coin test. Coin moved, margins wet. Possible human intervention, check camera. Camera footage shows a shadow crossing at 13:42. No human visible at entrance. Field note, anomaly. We began to make lists in the margins of our notebooks. Inventory style, the items small and domestic, because those are the things that most often escape notice, but which bind a life together. Cinnamon packet, vending machine, Friday 11, lamp blink, 3 beats, Tuesday 15, red car, 3 sightings in 6 days, coin moved, stoop, Sunday 24, phone calls, 2:22 a.m., multiple numbers, song repeat, market, Tuesday 22. Each line felt like evidence and like a confession. I started to explain less and to ask more. The observer's rule, knowledge changes responsibility, sat under our lists, like a base assumption we could not ignore. If we understood that sustained collective attention had a tendency to steer outcomes, then the question of waking others became an ethical problem that required more than passion. "What do we do with this?" Annika asked one night, holding a cup of tea like it might contain an answer. We spoke of ahimsa and activism and small acts. We argued about preaching. Several of us had tried to share, to warn, to push information onto forums and into columns. The result was always noise, ridicule, appropriation, banal clickbait headlines that turned what we feared into another wave to ride. The more we shouted, the more attention we generated. The more attention we generated, the more unpredictable the outcomes became. Ruth stood and walked to the window. She watched the street for a long time, then said, "Maybe we stop telling people. Maybe we just change how we act." She suggested modeling, living differently in ways that would be visible but not viral. A grocery clerk who smiles and pauses to write the name of the produce supplier. Someone on the bus who refuses to contribute to panic about a rumor. A teacher who names calm in the room like a shared object. The idea felt both small and terrifying in scale. What did it mean to act differently when everything seemed tuned to the loudest signal? The retired teacher, Margaret, pressed her thumb into a point on her map. "You can map influence," she said. "You can see where the red bleeds into the green." She had been tracking not only anomalies but also intentional acts that seemed to dampen red regions. It was an empirical note wrapped in moral consequence. "A single calm classroom," she said, "can change a street." This thinking, that action might be a lever, changed the tenor of our work, from observational to experimental. It was no longer enough to prove that something odd happened when people held the same thought. If attention could indeed nudge phenomena, then attention directed with intention might do the reverse. But intention carried its own dangers. Intentionally manipulating outcomes, even toward kindness, felt like playing with fire without understanding the rules of combustion. We needed protocols. We needed consent. We needed to test what we could and what we should. During this period, the observer reappeared twice more in my fieldwork. Each time the visit was short, measured, and left less as an answer than as an adjustment. The second visit came in a park at twilight. I had gone to test a hypothesis. That ambient crowd emotion at a transit hub might align with small, localized events. I was taking notes when the atmosphere shifted, and there it was again. The same tall presence, the same minimalism. It communicated without language this time. An image of a web, billions of points, and then a small, concentrated flare. It suggested scale. It suggested fragility. It suggested that across that web, we exerted pressure simply by choosing what to attend to. Its presence felt like a reminder that it watched because it was permitted to, an observer bound by something like rule or perhaps courtesy. It did not offer instruction beyond the fact the knowledge was now in me and that the knowing altered me. After that second meeting, I stopped pretending I was only an investigator. I felt morally implicated. Knowing that attention could influence outcomes meant I had to decide how to use attention myself. Could I ethically withhold information from those who might be harmed by panic? Could I ethically encourage people to adopt practices without their informed consent? The answers felt like barbed wire. We tested methods for reducing amplification. Ruth taught us how to practice passive blocking, a technique of positioning, grounding, and breathing that aimed to decrease the likelihood of a concentrated emotional flare. She insisted it was not a mystical shield, only a way to narrow the field of attention around a small group. Miles ran trials with the blocker present and absent. Sometimes the results suggested an effect, sometimes they did not. When they did, the difference was modest, but consistent enough to make us take it seriously. We also tried small acts of planting seeds, not sermons, not doomsday manifestos, small visible actions that might nudge attention without flaring it. A community garden left intentionally unharvested for someone to find. A bakery that priced loaves at a discount for a day without advertising the reason. A string of lights turned on in an otherwise dim street to invite people to walk a different path. The dual principle was this: attract attention gently in ways that modeled a state of being, rather than yelling a directive to millions. Those early trials yielded small victories. A patched community garden grew steadier foot traffic. A bakery's quiet generosity became a word-of-mouth rumor, not a trending hashtag. And the neighborhood reported fewer small thefts in the month following. I'm cautious about cause and effect, and I logged everything as correlation, with footnotes about confounding variables. But the consistent observation that behavior modeled quietly could coincide with measurable local shifts was enough to make us keep trying. There were setbacks. We accidentally amplified a rumor once by debating whether to suppress it. The debate itself created enough attention to seed an outcome we had hoped to prevent. That mistake was a lesson in humility. The silence of withholding can be as loud as the shout if we are not careful with the forms of attention we apply. The ethical hullabaloo rippled through the group. Some wanted to publish our findings and force a public discussion. Others wanted to stay small and deliberate. The retired teacher wanted to produce a measured paper with maps and timelines. Miles wanted to test again, and build a methodology that could be peer-reviewed. The artist wanted to make images that expressed what mere numbers could not. Anika wanted to teach people how to notice their own internal states and how those states felt in their bodies. Ruth argued for a practice-based approach, change local behavior, document, learn. We all agreed on one thing: we would not weaponize knowledge. That was more than a moral position. It felt like a necessity. The observer's initial admonition, knowledge changes responsibility, had taught me that intent could not be separated from consequence. If attention could create both harm and healing, then intent mattered. We had no right to steer outcomes without consent. The question of how to get consent from a public that did not know what to consent to became a riddle. In the background of our small experiments, the world provided larger, frightening examples of what sustained collective emotion looked like. There were episodes of mass panic that seemed to ripple across cities. Lines of people queuing for essentials one day, then no shortage the next. Spontaneous congregations around rumors. Waves of anxiety that coincided with spikes in emergency room visits for non-specific symptoms. I reviewed archived reports, newspaper clippings, audio feeds. There were clusters of correlation that worried me. I wrote pages of caveats about confirmation bias. I kept the pages anyway. During this time, a silent pattern started to emerge in our maps. Emotion runs like current. Where people amplified fear repeatedly, through rumor, through media cycles, through social reinforcement, the maps showed hotter zones. Where people modeled steadiness, where a teacher kept class calm while the news called for panic, those neighborhoods showed less intensity. It was not proof, only pattern recognition. But the pattern had a rhythm that suggested a threshold, a point at which local patterns might feed into each other and create something larger. We named that idea the critical mass, not because we had calculated it, but because language requires a name. Critical mass suggested a moment when the cumulative pressure of attention could tip a system into a new trajectory with inertia of its own. The possibility terrified some of us. It galvanized others into action. Our group grew slowly. People arrived in fits. A nurse who had noticed a ward-wide lull in complaints after starting a quiet ritual before rounds. A radio operator who kept logs of repeated call-ins during the same hour each night. A municipal worker who had begun to notice patterns in the ways crowds moved through plazas. Each new arrival brought a fresh set of data and a fresh ethical dilemma. We began to see the phenomenon as multidimensional. Attention was not only an individual act, but a network property. One night, crowded around a splotchy table with too many cups of cold coffee, Margaret pushed a tray of sticky notes toward the center and said, "We need categories. Who notices most reliably? Who can shield? Who can map? Who can test?" We scribbled until the sticky notes looked like a constellation. We assigned roles with awkward humor at first: mapper, tester, receiver, blocker, the same roles that had organized themselves naturally in earlier meetings. These labels helped us coordinate. They did not resolve our ethical quandaries. I kept thinking about the observer. It watched without direct intervention. Its non-intervention felt like law rather than indifference. In my private notes, I wrote variations of that thought. Observers respect choice. Observers, if they exist as entities in the way we mean, seem to stand at the perimeter of action and comment only on the moral weight of seeing. It was not comfort. It was a boundary. What do you do when a boundary becomes a mandate? How do you act differently in the knowledge that your attention has force? These were the questions that moved us from experiment into practice. We designed a controlled experiment, the way people who have spent years avoiding theatricality design one. Clumsy, cautious, and deliberately small. We would convene in a disused warehouse on the edge of the city, a place where noise could be contained. We would gather a small number of people, the map, the tester, the receiver, the blocker, myself, and we would attempt a measured act of communal attention. We would try to model steadiness, to create a small island of calm with as little publicity as possible. We would document every variable. We would prepare contingency plans. I remember the night before the warehouse meeting with a clarity that feels like a scar. I went back to the park where the observer had first shown me the web image. The bench was cold beneath me. The city hummed at a distance. I wrote in my notebook until dawn. Hypotheses, ethical frameworks, possible fail-safes. Knowledge changes responsibility, the line repeated. With each repetition, it became less a phrase and more a gravity. When I went to bed, I slept a little better than I had since the first encounter. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the relief of action. We were no longer only witnesses. We were beginning, in very small ways, to practice what it meant to carry the knowledge. We gathered the next morning at the warehouse. The space smelled of dust and oil, and the kind of neglect that lets a city forget a building. Light came through high windows in bands. People arrived with their instruments, their maps, and the quiet caution of students entering a lab for the first time. We said little. There were charts and watercolors and tampered cameras. We arranged chairs in a circle, the way therapists do when they want the room to feel flat rather than hierarchical. We set a protocol. We would model a calm conversation for an hour, a sustained attention toward a simple phrase, "We choose to be present." We were explicit that what we were doing was not prayer and not a religious act. It was a collective experiment to see if sustained, focused, non-viral attention could produce a measurable local effect. I sat in the circle and felt the edges of the world like a tide moving. I thought of the observer somewhere outside the warehouse, noting, cataloging, allowing. I thought of the people we had not met, the thousands who would continue to act without awareness, whose cumulative choices might tip the scale. I thought of the children who would grow up in a world where attention carried creative cost. When we began, the air felt ordinary. We breathed in and out with a careful rhythm. We spoke in turns, naming small things we appreciated, things that would not inflame or alarm. The reporter in me counted heartbeats. The private part of me listened for any change. An experiment is a slow narrative. It is a sentence you wait for the end of. Halfway through our hour, a woman outside the warehouse, someone who had not been invited, someone sifting the alley for discarded cans, paused at the gate. She stayed for 10 minutes, then left. Nothing spectacular happened. The next street over, an argument that had been bubbling drained away. A delivery truck rerouted itself a block earlier than usual. These were small and ambiguous outcomes, but in context, they registered like soft notes building toward a chord. They were not proof. They were direction. By the time the hour concluded, there was a tiredness that felt like a day's worth of honest labor. We logged our observations. We set follow-ups. We agreed awkwardly that we would repeat the experiment, that we would add controls, that we would refine our measures. We did not, importantly, call the press. Walking back to my car that evening, I felt both less alone and more burdened. The Observer's statement about responsibility had changed from a riddle into a metric I could not escape. We had done something small. We had not harmed anyone. We had not saved anyone. But we had made a choice to act with intention rather than with panic. There is a peculiar psychological cost to seeing potential consequences. It is not immediate terror so much as a slow, steady pressure behind decision-making. Every time I chose to withhold, to model, to plant a seed rather than scream, I felt the weight of a question. Is living differently enough? Are our small choices competent against a tide that grows when attention focuses on fear? The map told me that scale matters. The Observer's web suggested a network effect that might not be linear. Small differences could compound. We left the warehouse that night with plans and plans to fail. We were prepared to fail. We were prepared, too, to learn. The map in Margaret's hands looked slightly different by morning. A new node had lit up that none of us expected. It was a tiny hotspot on the edge of a suburb, coinciding with a rumor that had run through messages like a pestilence. We marked it and decided to keep watch. On my way home, I passed under a street lamp that blinked twice, then steadied. I, an ordinary man in a city of ordinary men, carrying an extraordinary secret. The thought circled like a gull and refused to land. Knowledge changes responsibility. I felt the sentence like a weight in my pockets. When I reached my apartment, I sat at the table and wrote for an hour. I catalogued decisions made and deferred. I listed experiments and their outcomes, noting the ones with consistent repeatability and the ones that vanished on retest. I made a plan for the coming week. 2 hours of mapping, 3 small planting experiments in neighborhoods Margaret had identified as malleable, and a dialogue with a local clinic about observational consent in public health messaging, not to manipulate, but to understand correlation. The more I wrote, the clearer the moral architecture of our work became. Observe accurately, test humbly, act minimally, ask consent where possible, model steadiness rather than shout alarm. These were guidelines in an ethical fog. At the edge of those notes I scribbled, in capitals and with the awkwardness of someone trying to pin air to paper. If this is true, scale is everything. If enough of us are unconscious, we might be creating the very things we fear. If enough of us choose differently, we might steer away from collapse or towards something else entirely, ascension, healing, a new normal. Or we might fail. There were no guarantees. There were only probabilities and choices, and the heavy sense that, now that I had asked the question the Observer had not wanted me to ask, I had a duty to be careful. The next morning the city looked like a field of small possibilities. People flowed in patterns I could feel rather than see. I walked to work and catalogued micro-interactions, the way a bus driver slowed to let a mother with a stroller on first, the cashier who called a customer by name, the boy who picked up the newspaper someone dropped. I noted them, not as anecdote but as data. Microseeds, each of them. I wondered what would happen if such gestures multiplied without being awarded attention by the algorithms that harvest trendiness. Could a subtle shift in behavior ripple outward without becoming publicity? Could we move the needle without screaming into the void? The answer for now felt provisional. The Observer's presence still hovered like a patient judge. The network of the awakened grew in fits and starts. Our experiments advanced with a counterintuitive economy. Smallness, repetition, patience. None of us felt heroic. None of us felt safe. We felt instead like people who had been asked to hold a single fragile truth. Attention mattered. How we chose to use it would perhaps determine what the world became. That week ended with a new note in my margin. Friday the 21st, new node. A rumor started in the morning about a shortage at a warehouse that served half the city. People lined up at stores. Panic amplified online. We tracked the maps and watched the red expand. We made calls to local contacts, sent people into neighborhoods to model calm, to hand out water with no fanfare, to quietly open community spaces as places to sit. We documented everything with the clinical detachment of people who knew their work was small, but refused to be inert. By Sunday, the lines had thinned. The map showed a small contraction at the edge where our people had been. It was not a victory. It was a single data point, but it was enough to make the shape of hope more visible. It was also enough to make the shape of dread larger. What if 1,000 such nodes failed simultaneously? What if the threshold we worried about was not hypothetical but a matter of days? I sat back in my chair and looked at the stacks of notes, the maps, the watercolors, the list of names. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the web of attention we were beginning to see. Inside, in our small group, the work had shifted from curiosity to custodianship. The phrase, "knowledge changes responsibility," had become less an admonition and more a task list. We were not heroes. We had no manual for what to do next. We had only practice, protocol, and the stubborn human habit of trying to make small things better. We had also, and this was the thing I kept returning to, and that made the observer's gesture feel like a promise rather than a threat, the capacity to choose. The capacity to choose in a networked world is both a gift and a danger. It requires discipline not to broadcast terror. It requires courage to model steadiness when crisis screams for the dramatic. It requires humility to test and to fail and to try again. On Monday, I received a short message. "Come to the warehouse tonight. Bring your notebooks." The signature was only a set of initials. My hands tightened around the phone as if it were a lifeline. Outside, a street lamp blinked once and stayed on. The city breathed. I closed my notebook and slid it into my bag. The pages rustled like a map. Knowledge had changed my responsibility. Now the clock was starting to move. The warehouse smelled of dust and old oil and a rain that had never quite dried. People arrived in the half-light like animals nudging a new territory, tentative, curious, alert. Margaret's maps were already spread across a long table, thumbtacked and layered, a cityscape made of blotches and threads that suggested motion rather than streets. Miles carried a battered recorder and a thermos with lipstick smeared on its rim. Annika set down a stack of small watercolors, amber streets, a bus stop lit like an eye. Ruth moved through the room like a current, her breathing deliberate, as if rehearsing the thing she meant to teach us. We had agreed to keep the circle small. 8 of us, plus 3 volunteers who had no role other than to be blind observers. Their names were ordinary: Eli, Rana, Tomas, and they sat stiffly, like people who had been told they were in an experiment, but didn't yet trust the experimenter. We read the protocol aloud. We checked cameras. We agreed on variables, number of minutes, the phrase, the brake signals, an exit plan if anything felt wrong. The phrase itself had been chosen with reluctance. It had to be neutral enough not to demand a vision and kind enough not to invite panic. We settled on, we choose to be present. We would state it, then hold it for the hour together without amplification, without any pretense of prayer or dogma. We would only attend to the feeling of being present, and we would measure what shifted in a small radius around the warehouse. I remember the first breaths in the circle like a separate weather. There is a peculiar clarity when a room of people agrees to a single modest task. Attention tightens. The recorder clicked. Someone pressed a small metal timer into my hand and said quietly, "Start when you're ready." I looked around the faces, at the taped maps, at the smudged watercolors. I caught a glance from Ruth, no expression, only a tilt of the head that said, "Keep your hands in your pockets." We began. At first nothing seemed different. The city hummed its usual frequencies, a distant truck, a laughter that leaked in from the street. We spoke, one by one, naming small things we were grateful for, A light in a yard, a window left open, a dog that knew its rote. The language was chosen to be mundane on purpose. We did not want to inflate. We kept our voices low. The air felt fuller, as if more sound could live in it without pressure. Half an hour in, a dog barked in the alley and then stopped. A lamppost 2 blocks away blinked once, then steadied. I could list those occurrences like laboratory notes and they would sound trivial, but I had been keeping trivial notes for weeks, and trivial did not always mean meaningless. Near the 40-minute mark, Annika coughed and then said very softly, "Something is moving." We all paused. She described an image that ran like a weaving through her chest, a latticework of small lights, like stars in a net. They pulsed, and then a denser cluster flared, and for the space of a breath I saw, in my mind's eye, the same thing she described. It was not a hallucination. It was not an insight that could be checked on a municipal server. It was a shared impression that left us quiet and raw. That night the city felt different on my way home. I kept thinking of that latticework as if it were a map of currents. Where attention pooled, it brightened. 2 nights later we convened again. This time we invited the observer to sit outside, visible only through a translucent curtain in the bay window, a silhouette against the street. The presence of it, because we had decided to make a boundary and then place a boundary-keeping being at the edge, changed the room. We felt observed in a way that was not invasive but precise. It was like being scanned with an honest instrument. It did not speak. It never did. In the way we understand speech, it offered impressions. Once, when Margaret asked a procedural question about whether mapping needed a population threshold, the image that came back was of a scale slowly tilting toward a point of tilt. Later, when we asked, clumsily, ethically, with too much human greed in our query, what averted a tipping, the reply arrived as a memory that belonged to no one in the circle. Hands folded around small acts, repeated like grain poured into a sieve, subtle and cumulative. At the height of that bewilderment, the curtain glowed. For an instant the warehouse vanished from me and I was somewhere else, above a city, looking down as if through smoked glass. The lights below were not houses but moments, someone laughing, someone closing a door, someone looking up at the sky. And then the lights tightened into currents and began to pulse towards certain nodes where the brightness became an insistence. In the middle distance, a new flare rose, sharper and hotter than the others, and I felt in my chest a sense of timeline compressing. When the vision released me, I sat back and felt nakedly responsible. The observer had not told us what to do. It had not suggested a plan that would guarantee survival or ascension. It had only shown the mechanism where attention becomes lockstep. Things begin to acquire inertia. We later began to call that compression a countdown. That name felt melodramatic for a long time. Later still I would hate the word and yet recognize how apt it was. Not a literal second counter, but a measure of urgency. The lattice gave me the impression of something that could, if pushed, fall into a new state. It suggested a window narrowing. We left the warehouse that night with the taste of iron in our mouths. The map in Margaret's hands had a new blot of red that none of us could explain. Data, dull or bright, poured in and we catalogued it. The methodology got better. We stopped inviting curious strangers to sit in on experiments. We tightened our measures. We created consent forms that read like the least dramatic legal documents you could imagine. Purpose, voluntary participation, right to withdraw. Miles rolled his eyes when we read them aloud, but later admitted the forms felt like armor. The group expanded slowly, the way fungus colonizes a damp wall, patches and spores, not a clean march. People arrived after small, singular events that left them uneasy. A nurse who noticed fewer calls after a soft ritual at shift change. A barista who kept a small notebook of customers' moods and found that reading names aloud in privation seemed to dampen a rush of anger. Once, a municipal sanitation worker came with the tale of a street where every night at 2:22 a.m. a light would blink 3 times and a person would pause at the curb and then move on. He had taken to leaving a single coin at that curb at dawn, and he reported with sheepish seriousness that sometimes the coin had been gone and sometimes it had simply shifted, its place slightly altered, as if someone else had decided it was needed. Word spread quietly as we had decided to let it. It spread by referral, by people who had experienced small changes and wanted to understand the pattern without having it turned into spectacle. We began to stratify our work. Mappers focused on networks and where attention pooled. Testers designed experiments to isolate variables. Receivers documented impressions and images. Blockers practiced containment and the subtle art of not looking. Then, there were the people who organized practical work. Planting community gardens, negotiating with small businesses to model calm, doing the quietly generous acts that returned to the group as an index of what planting a seed could mean. I learned 2 things during the months that followed which shaped everything. First, that non-viral modeling could change outcomes at the local scale. Second, that every attempt at broad disclosure risked chaining attention to panic. We experimented with both. The experiments that avoided mass exposure slowly dropped acts, examples that the local community could pick up without online amplification, often showed modest but consistent shifts. The experiments that went public were often devoured by the machinery of attention that turned everything into a meme or a moral outrage. Once, a simple video of a church choir singing a lullaby in a park was reposted, and then 1,000 angry comments latched onto it, spinning it into a debate about religion. The attention collapsed into an argument that left the park tenser than it had been before. We learned to be surgical with language. We trained members to speak in ways that did not incite curiosity beyond the necessary. We practiced describing an intention as an invitation rather than a command. "Look at this," we would say in private training. "Say only what is needed. Do not frame the act as salvation. Do not promise results. Offer a model." The ethical ballast of our work became heavier as we grew. People wanted to know, why not tell everyone? Why not shout from rooftops and demand people choose calm? The answer always returned to 2 things: consent and feedback loops. 1,000 alarms, even if well-meaning, could create the very wave they sought to prevent. And consent, in our view, meant people had to know enough to understand the force they were invited to wield. That is a high bar. At one point, a member of the group proposed a radical idea. What if we created a public training, a workshop that taught simple awareness practices? Half wanted to pilot it, half feared the workshop's promotional blip would seed an attention spike. We compromised. We ran invitation-only sessions in community centers with strict participant limits and no online promotion. The sessions were small, sleepy things at first. 20 people in a church basement, a circle, a focus on noticing breath. The participants reported feeling calmer for a day or 2. Some came back. A few told friends. The trick, it seemed, was low hum, not a siren. Growth therefore happened like a tide moving through cracks. A nurse's ritual spread through the nurses' lounges of one hospital. A grocery clerk's small, deliberate kindness found itself mentioned in a neighborhood forum as that small thing someone did that made my day. None of these became headlines. They were small and multiplied. But the critical mass, the lattice that the observer had shown us, remained a specter. We could see it sharpening in Margaret's maps. Nodes where fear repeatedly concentrated were hotter, and the network lines between them suggested a potential for contagion that could be functional and directional. The maps began to show not just heat, but velocity, how fast attention transmitted from one node to another. Margaret began to annotate with dates and vector arrows. She would stand by the map and say simply, "It moves faster when broadcast meets scarcity." That line, Broadcast meets scarcity was one of the few places our notes resembled policy. Whenever a rumor about a shortage ran, the maps lit as if a match had been struck. Panic concentrates attention, and attention appears in our observations to increase probability of the feared outcome. Always with caution, always with hedges. Never a claim of causation airtight enough for a peer-reviewed paper. But the pattern repeated enough to make the ethical question urgent. People started asking harder questions. What about structural injustices that made scarcity real? What about systems, economic, ecological, that would create a genuine shortfall? Our methods addressed only the emergent property of attention. They did nothing to fix underlying inequities. We were not healers in the way policy is. We had no illusions about that. We were, at best, practitioners in a realm of emergent human dynamics, trying to dampen some waves and nudge others. That limitation kept us humble. One afternoon, a new member arrived at a meeting with a printed article clutched in his hand. He had been a data analyst for a municipal department and had pulled traffic records and call logs to test for coincidences during a neighborhood panic 2 months earlier. He had applied statistical models, as clean and skeptical as one could be, and claimed to have found non-random clustering around certain signals. We read the syntax of his charts like scripture. Even his careful work could not prove a metaphysical cause. It did, however, provide a different kind of corroboration. Independent lines of data pointing toward a phenomenon that required attention. The warehouse experiments escalated subtly. We added controls. We began rotating blind observers in and out, planting false targets to test expectation bias. We used decoy phrases. Miles invented a method for randomizing the moment a participant would intend a small image, so we could measure whether timing correlated with outcomes better than chance. The experiments were messy, and the failures outnumbered the successes. But the successes accumulated. Then came the night of the vision that felt like a hinge. We had convened because a cluster of nodes had lit along the river. 3 neighborhoods and a transit hub. Rumors of supply shortages circulated like static. We agreed to gather a larger group than usual, 30 people in a disused loading dock that sat 3 stories up and had windows looking at the river. The decision was cautious and felt dangerous, because a larger grouping risked the very synchronization we worried about. We mitigated by instructing participants to focus inward, to attend to a phrase devoid of urgency. We notice. The intention was to observe, not to push. Halfway through the session, the air changed. It was not a single sensation, but a stacking. The sound outside smoothed, as if being compressed. The light at the windows gained a granularity. The watercolors on the table seemed to ripple as if submerged. Annika felt it first, and she said aloud in clipped language because she could not help herself, "It's the lattice again." The rest of us, mappers, testers, blockers, the volunteers, felt it like a pressure wave. The room seemed to tilt inward. Then, without a clear seam, the warehouse dissolved into an immense visual field that no single set of eyes could account for. We were simultaneously local and global. I could feel my feet on the concrete and also see, in a panoramic sweep, billions of small points, people, connected by threads of gleaming filaments. This time the vision bore edges like the teeth of a clock. There was not a digital countdown displayed, not a number that marched in seconds, but a sense of fractions collapsing. The web pulsed. Certain nodes, cities, marketplaces, chat threads, flickered like beacons. Most of the points moved with random smallness, a phone call, a door closing, a child laughing. But clusters of synchronized attention, those were different. Where attention synced to fear, the filaments hot-wired into a stronger cord that began to vibrate and thicken. Where attention pooled into steadiness, people holding a collective breath of calm, the filaments shone green and damped nearby flickers. At the center of the field there was a line of brightness that suggested trajectory. It looked, in a terrible clarity, like a river of light draining toward a low and hungry basin. The impression we all received without words was that if a certain volume of synchronized fear reached that basin, it would change the flow of many other lines, creating an inertia that would last beyond the originating event. I remember thinking, with a calmness that did not match the image, that the observer had not been boasting. It had been warning. When we returned, gasping and damp with the intensity of the shared impression, we tried to translate the vision into usable language. We argued for hours about whether to characterize what we had seen as a countdown. Margaret wanted a neutral term, threshold, inflection point, while Miles wanted to name the speed we had seen it travel. People were raw, some were terrified. A volunteer who had not spoken much, Thomas, left with his hands shaking and did not return for days. We changed tactics. The group split into nodes that would do different things simultaneously, but quietly. Mappers intensified surveillance of the lit regions. Blockers hunkered in neighborhoods that had been identified as potential vectors and practiced presence without creating spectacle. Testers ran counterfactuals in private. What if a bus stop during rush hour was modeled differently for a week? Would complaints drop? Would the node cool? We could not assume scale from a single trial, but repeated patterns could point us toward more robust predictions. The concept of critical mass hardened into an operational parameter, a range described in probabilities, not numbers. We estimated with wide error bars that as synchronization of attention rises, so does the probability of a correlated material effect. The trick was the coupling between synchronization and scarcity or threat. 1 million people quietly worrying about money is different from 1 million people panicking because stores are empty. The first creates a substrate. The second is the spark. Thus, our interventions focused on dampening sparks while working, modestly, to change the substrate. There were moral pitfalls. We were criticized from all directions. Some accused us of cowardly secrecy. Others branded us as manipulators who wanted to puppeteer public mood. A few thought we were anarchists trying to subvert public discourse. Each criticism stung, and often with cause. We had no right to direct populations without their consent, so we redoubled the parts of our work that emphasized consent: workshops, opt-in community gatherings, partnerships with local leaders where possible. We also communicated more often with local institutions, clinics, shelters, schools, presenting our work as a community practice rather than a shadow politics. Then came an escalation that shook us in a different way. A neighboring city experienced a cascade they could not trace. A rumor about a pathogen, no evidence, only talk, swept online. Panic grew, and with it a series of events that matched patterns we had seen in the lattice. Hoarding, roadblocks, spikes in calls to emergency services for vague symptoms. We deployed teams to open calm spaces in grocery parking lots, to hand out water bottles without announcing a motive, to sit quietly and remind people with soft, direct language to check sources. The media got wind, not because we wanted them to, but because a blog had posted an unverified account of our secret exercises. And the attention, predictably, swelled. We failed in one neighborhood. A rumor had crossed a line into reality. A shortage at a local distribution center had substance. Our soft interventions made no measurable dent in the line's anxiety. People had reasons beyond attention. We had been naive to think that attention alone could rectify structural scarcity. The failure humbled us. It also made our later successes feel less like miracles and more like careful applications of a limited tool. The world, it turns out, has many levers. Attention is one, infrastructure is another, policy is a third. We had been given, if given is the right word, an insight about attention. It was not a fix for everything. Living with that limitation became a part of our ethics. Still, incremental wins accrued. A community garden that had been tended quietly by our volunteers became a meeting place where arguments eased. A bakery that offered a handful of free loaves each morning, with no announcement, created a ripple of gratitude. Not every success was tracked by the maps. Many were anecdotal. But over months, our piecemeal efforts coalesced into a pattern. Neighborhoods where repeated small acts of modeling calm occurred without viral exposure showed lower heat on Margaret's maps. The correlation did not prove causation, but it did make us act. As our work matured, so did the pressure. People outside our circle wanted training, some requested public talks. We created a curriculum, observation first, test second, model third. The curriculum emphasized humility and consent. We practiced techniques for de-escalation that did not rely on slogans or moralizing. Instead, we taught people to notice heart rate, to change breathing patterns in public, to offer practical gestures, water, a chair, a list of local resources, without dramatic narratives. The aim was to shift the ambient tone of a space, not to create a social media moment. Numbers crept up. Our inner group, the 8, swelled to dozens, then to a few hundred who followed local nodes. We tracked that growth not with pride, but as another variable. More people meant more capacity to seed, but it also meant greater risk that someone would broadcast a well-meaning video and create amplification. We had to train for that too. Protocols for when a member saw their action go viral by mistake. Scripts for redirecting attention away from spectacle. Ways to respond with transparency that avoided fueling panic. There were personal costs. I stopped sleeping as soundly. The responsibility of holding knowledge that seemed to translate into moral work is heavy. I missed dinners. I grew distant with people who did not understand why I would not speak about certain things. I lost friends who accused me of being paranoid. Some moments felt unbearably Sisyphean. We would damp a node and weeks later another would flare. I would sit at my kitchen table, the notebook spread out like an accusation, and wonder if any of it mattered. Then the observer returned. We had not expected to see it again. The visits had always been rare and brief, like the interventions of an old, stoic mentor. This time it appeared outside my window at dusk, just as a winter rain began to smear the streetlights into halos. It did not enter. It simply stood where people stand when they are considering whether to speak. I walked out onto my stoop and it was there, vast and quiet, a silhouette against the wet pavement. In a voice that was not a voice, or rather in an interior press of images and impressions that the skin seems to take as words. It offered something that felt like a memory that did not belong to me. It showed me a life before my birth, or at least a sense of the choices that loom before life begins. A corridor, light at the end, a small decision offered, a temperature, a tone, a constellation of likely surroundings. The implication was not theological in the doctrinal sense. It was more like a map of predispositions. Choice, the observer reminded in shape and beat, is integral. We are given a threshold where intention is possible. Then it showed 2 images in rapid succession. One of a species rising into a new coherence, less brittle, less violent, and another of a species folding on itself under the weight of repeated panic and scarcity. It did not say which was more likely for us. It did not say it would intervene. It only watched and offered a catalogue of past outcomes. Its hand, if it can be called a hand, touched my chest. The contact was cool and then warm, a pressure like palms held over a beating thing. I felt a surge of memory not my own. 1,000 small gestures accumulated into a river, an overlooked kindness that had multiplied, a rumor that had not been quelled and had bred something worse. That cascade of impressions did not translate into a prophecy. It translated into responsibility. You understand, it seemed to say without moving lips, or you do not. The rest is yours. When it withdrew, the rain had paused. I stood on the stoop with my hair damp and the city breathing in small, indifferent waves. Knowledge had altered the terrain of my life yet again. I felt not chosen but tasked, as if a simple permission had been noted and I had to live into it. After that encounter, our operations sharpened. We formalized training. We established small, local councils that would be the first responders to flares, not with sirens, but with slow hands and practical presence. We published in careful, neutral language a set of best practices for community actors. Observe, document, model, and always seek consent when inviting participation. The document was not viral. That was by design. Growth continued. From 12 to 43 to 120 in 18 months. People organized in neighborhoods and then city clusters. The maps grew more granular. Sometimes the count stabilized. Sometimes it did not. There were moments of celebration. A reduction in calls for a week at a clinic. More people attending a community meal without argument. But nothing felt irreversible. The lattice was always there, patient and indifferent to our anxieties. Then came a moment everyone who had been awake for long enough feared. A simultaneous hyper-focus on a single idea occurred across multiple regions. A rumor, this time about an energy shortage, found purchase in a set of conditions that made it plausible. The rumor moved fast because it piggybacked on a real policy debate. The combination of social media chatter and a plausible infrastructure problem created synchronized fear that pushed many nodes into high heat. We mobilized. We dispatched blockers to transit hubs. We organized quiet information booths that offered verified contact numbers and safe spaces for calm conversation. We opened community kitchens with no press. We practiced the difficult art of being visible but not viral. Steady tents with logos that offered practical resources and nothing more. The media did report on the crisis but framed it as policy rather than mass hysteria. Our models held in some places and failed in others. The critical mass did not wholly tip. We bent the arc enough that certain outcomes did not occur. We also watched others, cities where attention had cascaded unchecked, slide into shortages and conflict. The variation taught us something essential. Timing matters and context matters. In places where structural resources were already stressed, the lattice functioned like tinder. Where infrastructure was robust, attention alone had less causal force. That is an ugly, honest reality. Attention is a factor among many, and sometimes it is necessary, but insufficient. We had the moral clarity to say that out loud and to encourage public policy that addressed infrastructures. The years that followed carried a steady rhythm. Experiments, failures, small successes, an expanding network of people who practiced a kind of public composure. We avoided grand promises. We never claimed we would guarantee survival. We never promised ascension. These remained speculative potentialities, not predestined outcomes. Our practice was pragmatic: plant seeds, tend, and see what grows. People asked sometimes if the observer wanted us to spread the knowledge. I could only answer for my own sense. It seemed to stand outside immediate intervention and to respect the autonomy of the species it observed. That non-intervention was not indifference. It was, in its own strange way, a demand for agency. We were left to choose. The movement's motto, when it eventually crystallized into one, was dull and human. Notice and act. Notice your interior. Act in small, steady ways. Do not amplify fear. Offer concrete help. That was it. We added practices. 2-minute breath checks before making public announcements, small community rituals of naming needs and resources, a network of volunteers who offered calm presence in places prone to panic. We tracked growth in the margins of our notebooks. Monday, 12 new volunteers trained in the 2-minute practice. Wednesday, a bakery quietly hosted a free day. Friday, a map showed slight cooling around a transit hub. These were not the headlines worth memeing. They were the meat of our labor. I should be honest. The work was exhausting and morally ambiguous. Sometimes we made choices that felt ethically uncomfortable because the lesser harm required it. I argued with colleagues over whether to withhold information that might cause panic. We often erred on the side of transparency, but transparency is a tricky thing when your problem is amplification. The conversation never had final answers. It was an ongoing negotiation of values. As the pattern became more public knowledge, always framed as personal practice rather than a secret technique, small curricula emerged in community colleges and in neighborhood centers. Observational journaling, mapping exercises, consent-focused outreach. A handful of journalists wrote careful pieces about our methods. A few researchers reached out with interest in collaboration. We learned to translate our field notes into forms that could be examined without sensationalizing. And still the lattice pulsed. One winter evening, a year and a half after the warehouse experiment that changed everything, we convened another meeting. Numbers had expanded. There was a sense in the room that we had slowed the rate of flares in certain regions, but had not changed the overall probability distribution of future events. The maps showed a long tail of potential hotspots. Margaret traced them with a tired finger and said, "We are not out of time. We are not the first to try, and we are not the last." We then proposed an experiment that none of us took lightly. A public 2-week observational challenge designed not to be viral, but to be local and voluntary. The challenge was simple. We drafted the text, and then debated it for days until it was as minimal as we could make it. For 2 weeks, notice your recurring thoughts about risk or scarcity. Write down 3 repeated thoughts each day. Note any small outcomes you observe that follow the thought. At the end of the week, talk with a trusted neighbor about what you noticed. No social media, no petitions, just private observation and neighborly discussion. The intention was not to coerce, but to increase self-awareness at scale. We piloted it in 2 neighborhoods with community partners. The uptake was modest. Participation rates were higher among people who had experience in mindfulness or community organizing. The results were noisy, as expected. But the signal, in aggregate, suggested that people who tried the exercise noticed the links between their repeated anxious thoughts and small behavioral outcomes, buying more, staying home, calling others, and that noticing sometimes allowed them to slow a cascade. We made the challenge public in a non-spectacular way. Flyers in laundromats, small notes at clinics, word of mouth through community leaders. The request was gentle. Participate if you want. No promises, no snake oil. When the 2 weeks ended, we gathered the volunteers to debrief. Many reported a strange relief at being asked to notice rather than to fix. Several told stories of a neighbor who had stopped themselves from starting a rumor. A few had gently intervened in a line at a store, and the tension dissolved. No miracles, just small changes. The observer did not offer applause. It offered no fireworks. But some nights later I stood on my balcony and watched a neighborhood 3 blocks over where lights did not blink like beacons, but glowed steady. I imagined, perhaps mistakenly, a slow cooling of a node. I felt a small, immense gratitude. I do not want to claim victory. We had not solved anything. The lattice was still there, patient and indifferent. The countdown, the impression of a window, continued, though sometimes its edge seemed less keen. We had bought time, perhaps. We had nudged probabilities. We had created a practice that made people more aware of their interior lives. That, in itself, felt like a monumental smallness. In the end, the work comes back to choices. We teach people to ask a simple question in moments of rising panic. Will this amplify fear, or will this model calm? It is not always possible to answer cleanly. Systems are messy. People are messy. The observer's minimalism, its respect for choice, haunted us as both an ethic and a constraint. We never wanted to become a force that seizes agency. Our aim was to increase it. Before I finish, I will offer something practical. something small you can test yourself, because much of our early confidence came from people doing tiny experiments and reporting back. This is not a promise, it is an invitation. For 2 weeks, notice and record. Each evening, write down the 3 thoughts or images that returned most often during the day, especially those about lack, danger, or scarcity. Note, next to each thought, one small action you took that day that might have been prompted by it. Did you buy an extra item? Did you call someone? Did you avoid a place? After the 2 weeks, share your log with one trusted person, not online, not broadcast, just one local confidant, and discuss patterns. The aim is not to control outcomes, but to gain awareness of your own rhythm. If many people do this quietly in a neighborhood, the aggregate increase in self-awareness could, in our experience, slow a flare. If you feel called to explore this with a little more guidance, we have a modest optional resource, a short guide and a set of structured journaling prompts that walk you through the 2-week observation. It is in the pinned comment, signaled as an optional paid guide for those who want coaching and templates. It is not necessary to participate in the practice, and it does not confer special powers. It exists for people who ask for a scaffold. The work is ours together, whether you use the guide or not. I will end with the truth that has threaded itself through everything I've written. Knowledge changes responsibility. That sentence, whatever weight it carries, has been at once an admonition and a compass. It has led us to act slowly and to argue fiercely about what it means to be accountable to what we know. We have learned that attention can be creative in ways that are mundane and in ways that are dangerous. We have learned that the ethical route is rarely the spectacular one. It is the long one. Repeated acts of steadiness, small kindnesses unadvertised, a refusal to weaponize fear. We have not been granted certainty. We have been given a choice. We still do not know if 100,000 small acts will tilt the lattice into a harvest or only postpone a storm. The observer watches. It waits. It respects that we decide. For now, the countdown is more a rhythm than a deadline. It moves, it contracts, it expands. We have slowed it in some places and watched it surge in others. We have planted seeds and measured small sprouts. We have learned to value ordinary bravery, the courage it takes not to shout but to stand and offer water, to name a need without inflaming it, to stop and consider a thought before broadcasting it to 1,000,000 ears. We haven't won. We haven't lost. We are, for the moment, keeping a watch and doing our best to live differently so our lives might matter in the ways that count. If you choose to try the 2-week observation, do it with a neighbor. Keep it private. Keep it real. If you want a template to guide you, check the pinned comment for an optional guide and a few paid, small group sessions where we go through the practice with an emphasis on consent and local action. No promises, only methods and humility. There is terror in the knowledge that we can create what we fear. There is, simultaneously, a kind of hope. The same faculty that can escalate a rumor can, with patience and discipline, cultivate steadiness. The world is not simply a thing that happens to us. Our attention threads through it, sometimes thinly, sometimes in strong ropes. The question remains, what will we use those ropes to make? My hands still sweat now and then. Sometimes I dream of lattices. Sometimes I wake and find the street quiet and think of nothing but a shallow, ordinary gratitude. The weight of responsibility has not left me. It probably never will. But there is work to do, and occasionally a moment where I can see a street cool a little, and I am reminded that small things add up. We haven't won. We haven't lost. We are still watching, and we are still choosing.